talk to you today about writing for young readers. It's a passion of mine, obviously. And we're going to be focusing on middle grade and young adults. If you write picture books and have questions, feel free to ask them. And if you have questions as we go along, please ask. I'll also leave some time at the end to talk about that. So, as you said, my name is Sumner Johnson. This is a picture of my middle grade book that's out, and I have a picture book that will be coming in another year from now. So, I have no picture of that one yet. Look forward to that. So Madeline Langell, famous author, has said, you have to write the book that wants to be written. And if the book will be too difficult for grown-ups, then you write it for children. I love this quote because I think a lot of people look at books for youth and they say, oh, that's easy. I'm going to do that because that's easier than writing for adults. And that is not true. Any of you, if you have done it, it's not true. When you write for children, not only do you have to make difficult, complex subjects accessible to young readers, you also have to make them enjoyable for adults who are the gatekeepers that allow those books to get to your readers. So writing for children is a little bit complex, but a lot of the same things that you would do in writing for an adult, you would do writing for children. There are, however, some different basics that you have to look at when you're doing this. So we're going to talk about that today. I want to start with middle grade books. This is just a few of some of the books that I really enjoyed. There's so many good ones. Harry Potter, of course, has to be on there. Kind of spurred, wasn't the start of middle grade fiction, but it really opened the field and just caused the boom, you might say, of all the books that have come out since then. So let's talk about the basics for middle grade. First consideration is audience. If you write a middle grade book, your audience are 8 to 12-year-olds. Some publishers will say 9 to 13. I think that's what mine says. But, you know, if you have a 7-year-old who's reading up, they're probably going to be reading these as well. But 8 to 12-year-old, you have to remember that is who you are writing for. Word counts. So, obviously, there just aren't as many words in middle grade books as there are in other books. So if you're writing a realistic story, 25 to 60,000 is pretty typical. Mine had 55,000, for example. If you're writing fantasy, they figure it's going to take extra time to get your world building in there, so they allow you some extra words. 35 to 75,000. Now, is it strict? Is that going to be, they're going to say, oh, you've got 76,000 tops, sorry. No, it's not like that, but word counts do matter, and editors do look at that, especially when you are beginning out. So content. Some middle grade books do have art here and there. Most don't. But they do deal with complex stories and issues, and most things can be discussed. We'll talk about that a little more further on, but we have a lot of complex issues that we deal with when we're writing middle grades. Your buyers. I think it's always important to know who's going to be buying your book if you're wanting to succeed as an author. Parents and teachers and librarians are the main ones who will be purchasing middle grade books. Some kids do, but on a limited level. You have book fairs, for example, but that's a very curated set of books, right? So parents, teachers, librarians, that's your main group. And finally, special cases, they don't quite fit into the rest. Novels in verse, basically a book of poems that tell a story. They could be all sorts of poetry, all combined in different ways, but they all combine to tell a story of a single person. It's used a lot of times when you have a really tough topic. It's a way to kind of take a step back and tell a story that might just not quite work in prose. And graphic novels have just exploded in the last little bit. It used to be maybe there would be a series and they'd all be comic book characters, and it's not the case anymore. You've read, I want to say the new one, Best Friends. Real Friends was the first one. Best Friends is coming out with Shannon Hale. It's not a standalone since they're making it, but it could be a standalone, right? They didn't need a second book. And it's taking a topic that would be in any normal middle grade book and making it into this graphic novel that really engages the age group that it aims for. So those are some special cases. If you are interested in graphic novels, I say go that direction because that's where it's headed. So young adult fiction. Just a few that are popular. It's hard to fit them all on the page, but Cinder, Girl in Pieces, of course Twilight. They also kind of spurred the whole YA thing. So let's talk about those basics. So your audience, 14 to 18. You notice 13 kind of gets the shaft, right? 13 and 14 is a difficult age, and it's kind of a hole. It's something that's being discussed right now. There's this hole of books, lack of books that aren't there for those aged readers. And hopefully they're going to find a solution, but it's about placement on shelves, which should not be the reason we don't have books for these kids, right? But 14 to 18-year-old, a lot of times you'll talk about upper YA and lower YA, and so those upper ones are going to have harder subjects. The lower YA is going to be a lot lighter, more almost towards middle grade, but not so much. Maybe dealing with topics that you wouldn't do in middle grade. Word counts, 40 to 90,000, so we're up from the middle grade. That's for if you're writing something that's realistic in a setting that already exists usually. And then of course fantasy, 50 to 120,000. So I have the 120,000 on there because you will see a lot of that. However, if you've not published one, I would highly recommend you do not break the 100,000 mark. You want your count to be below that for your first book. Obviously, there are some that are much, much, much bigger, even than 120. Those are by established authors who have proven that they can make sales. And then publishers are willing to take a chance on the added expense of having the added pages. So if you are writing it new, less than 100,000, but they figure you need the extra space for world building that should take place in a fantasy novel. Content, you've got a wide range of genres. Basically, any genre you've got in adult, you're going to have in young adults, right? You've got romance, you've got fantasy, you've got urban fantasy, you've got mystery, all of that. It takes it all in. And it's open to most content. Obviously needs to attract readers who are in your audience, but in YA, they're dealing with everything, all the hard stuff, all the hard topics that you could expect. Sex and drugs and alcohol and suicide, all of that is dealt with. Whereas in middle grade, you've got some issues there. So your buyers, again, are parents, teachers, and librarians, and kids. More so kids this time. You've got a lot more teens who are buying books for themselves, especially on Kindles. In middle grade, Kindles haven't really taken off ebooks. But in YA, ebooks do really well. So that's just something to keep in mind. In special cases, you won't see I'm sure they have the novels and bursts and the graphic novels in YA, but not as much. But crossover books, what that means is that publishers are hoping to take in not just the audience of 14 to 18-year-olds, but also all the adults too. They want to make topics that basically sell more books, right? And so what you see that a lot in is fantasy. You'll see fantasy books that maybe they really shouldn't be a YA book, but they'll make it a YA because then they capture more audience. So if you have a book, a lot of times they'll have protagonists who are like 19, 20, in the early 20s, and they'll make that a YA book sometimes. All right, so writing juvenile fiction. Just to give a quick overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about voice, because I think voice is key. If you want to write an engaging novel for young adults, you need to get the voice right. Plot and character. There are some differences between this and what you might see in adult books, so we're going to talk about some of those in plot and character. And if we have time, we'll talk about structure. I might skip over this section depending on how fast we go through it. Again, please ask questions as if we're on the topic and you have a question on it, please do that. So voice. When I first was writing and I met with an editor for the very first time at a conference, I was so nervous, and I met with him, he read my stuff, and his comment to me was, it seems like you haven't really found your voice. Voice? What are you even talking about? Of course it's my voice. I wrote it. I put those words down on the paper. What do you even mean? And it took a while for me to figure out that he meant more specifically, as an author, the voice you create for your book. So it's an author's style, which includes attitude, personality, character, that thing, that je ne sais quoi, that sets it apart, right? So you'll find a lot of authors, you can recognize their voice from book to book. J.K. Rowling has a very readable, conversational voice when you read her stuff. I love her voice. Hemingway is known for his short sentences, his style. People know that he's going to get to the point with short, snappy sentences, right? And so a lot of authors, over time, they create this voice, but you need to specifically make a voice that's going to be relatable to your readers, your younger readers. So things to consider that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about your audience and how voice will affect that, and we're going to talk about word choice because it matters when you're writing for children. All right, so audience. First things to consider: the age of the main character. Basically, the age of your main character decides what you are writing, what type of book you are writing, middle grade or YA. If you are writing YA, you're going to have a character who is the same age as a YA reader. So generally speaking, between 14 and 18 years old. It's good to keep in mind that readers, teens and middle grade readers, they like to read above their own age, usually a couple of years. So, however, they do top off at 18, right? So if you make a character who's 19, it's going to be problematic. So we do top off at 18, but think about 2 years older. So my character, for example, is 10 in my book. And so readers from 8, mine was considered a younger middle grade novel as well. So readers who are 8 are going to identify with that up to 10. I've noticed when I do class visits or Skype visits with classes, once I get to 6th grade where they're 12 and 13, they start to get a lot more skeptical about these characters. Oh, they're 10. Huh. So the age really determines what it is you're writing. So you need to choose that age carefully. And in terms of voice, your characters are going to speak differently, right? If you have a 10-year-old character on the one side versus an 18-year-old character on the other side, they're going to speak differently, right? They're going to have different expressions that they use, different ways of speaking. Those are things that need to be considered when you are writing that. Kids will call you out real fast, right? If you write in an adult style that's supposed to be them speaking, they will notice. They know. And the other thing we need to consider is what is appropriate and understandable for that age. So, for example, humor. A lot of YA is known for sarcasm, but sarcasm does not work in middle grade, for example. And you need to know this. I have my 12-year-old here. He'll ask me sometimes, Mom, are you being sarcastic? He's pretty sure he knows when I'm being sarcastic. He's not 100%, and it doesn't even, in writing, it translates even less. So sarcasm, for example, if you're writing middle grade, you probably want to avoid sarcasm. You also need to think of appropriate humor that they might use, right? What adults think is funny is not always going to be what kids think is funny. That dry British humor, for example, maybe not so much for the teens, right? With middle grade, you have a lot of that bathroom humor, that the Three Stooges type physical humor. They love that stuff. But maybe that's not going to be like what's best for YA. So you need to know your audience. You need to know what type of humor you're going to be using, things to avoid, such as sarcasm in middle grade. And subject matter. This one is key. If you're writing for middle grade, for example, most topics can be approached, but the way you do it is key. And you also need to be prepared that if you are writing about certain topics, you might have some issues going forward. Kate Messner, I don't know if you've heard of her, but she writes middle grade. She wrote a book that dealt with alcohol abuse in the home, and she had several visits set up with schools. And there were several that called her back and said, our principal doesn't want to have this topic in our school. Suicide, for example. If you try and deal with that directly, it probably will not pass an editor. It can be dealt with, though. I have a friend who she recently sold a book that deals with suicide. Happened before the book ever began. None of the events of that are on the page. It's all in the past, and it's of a peripheral character. So you've got the main character who's dealing with it in a much later time. So it can be dealt with, but you have to be cautious as you choose things. Romance, for example, is a no-no in middle grade. Kids just aren't interested in that yet. In YA, yes, absolutely, that's acceptable. Middle grade, you just can't do it. So all of those subjects, you have to know what your reader is interested in. You can deal with tough topics. My book, for example, Foreclosure, it's not something you usually think about for a kid, but it depends on how you look at it. I wanted to see how kids went through the same thing that adults went through and dealt with it from their perspective. So you can deal with most subjects, but you have to be cautious in how you go about that. So word choice, the big question that always comes up. In fact, even just this last week, I had a big conversation on that. Swearing, yes or no, in middle grade and YA books. So there are a wide range of opinions on this, having run through a lot of the conversations. Middle grade, I can tell you from experience, just don't do it. Even words that are heading that direction, jerk, darn, things like that. I have the word jerk in my book, and so my editor, he marked that. He's like, well, just make it clear that they're knowing they shouldn't be saying this word, or maybe you should cut this one out because it's not really necessary. So even those types of words, you've got to be creative. It's not to say kids don't swear because they do, but in middle grade particularly, they have to get through all of those gatekeepers. You have to get through parents, you have to get through teachers, you have to get through librarians, and a lot of times they have problems using it in the class when there are swear words. So middle grade, I would strongly recommend you not do it. YA, it's used a lot more often. I will say this. There are those who are on the end that say, oh yeah, absolutely, kids swear, you should just, to make it realistic, you need to have that. And there's going to be the other end that say, no, you don't, because again, you're going to have trouble with all these other readers. And there are those that are somewhere in the middle. Well, only when it's absolutely necessary to show the how the character is feeling. If it's true to the character, you got to be true to the character. And I think that's something that you as an author have to decide. But you should know that it can be limiting. And if you use it too much, it can feel repetitive, and it can feel like, oh, they just threw it in, just throw it in. So I would say proceed with caution. But you know your characters, you know where you want to go with that, and it's a decision you have to make. Appropriate reading levels. So with YA, you don't have to worry about it quite so much. But with middle grade, you do. Because these books, they're kind of the first big books that kids are reading, right? And you want them to feel successful. The thing about middle grade is very much about nurturing readers and bringing kids into the love of reading. And if you're giving them all kinds of words that are too big for them to read, it does not nurture love of reading. It makes them frustrated and it's harder to read. I am not against using big words to teach, absolutely. But maybe consider your moments. Is this one I'm really wanting to teach her? Can you say it another way? My editor, for example, he marked several words and said, maybe you could find a more simple word than this one. And it's not that we want to dumb it down, because absolutely we don't. But we do want to make our readers feel successful and enjoy the process of reading, because reading is wonderful, and that's what we're trying to build. Genre. That's also going to influence your word choice. If you are writing a historical novel about Ben Franklin, for example, your words are going to be very different than if you're writing a book that's a fantasy that includes dragons, right? You might even create some words if you're writing about dragons, but you have to choose those words. Now going back to the history one, I do want to mention, while you want to get the feel that this took place in history, we are not writing the way that they wrote back then, the way that they spoke back then, because it would not be interesting. It would really just frustrate our readers. So you want to make it feel like they're in the past, but really they're reading present day language, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge, especially I think when you get to the middle grade level, but I think it's a fun challenge, right? All these things makes it fun. Tone, serious versus funny, simple versus literary, scary versus quiet. All of these things are going to influence the type of language that you're using in your book, because you want to give that feel. And I think this is true for any book that you write, not just for children's. But if you're writing about a scary story in a mansion that looks like that, your word choice is going to be very different than if you're writing about a house that's pink and purple and fluffy, right? Or I don't know, it could be a pretty interesting story, so maybe you should try that. Cultural, socioeconomic, regional aspects. These are also things to consider. If you are writing for someone who lives in this house, you probably have different expectations than if they were to live in a mansion like this one, right? Those are things you need to take into account. If you're writing a story that takes place in the South, they have a very different twang than we have here in the West. I have to think about this. I've lived in many different places. And I think it's important to know your audience. But one quick thought on that. If you are writing, you want to get that Southern feel, for example, in the way they speak, do it with caution. Don't try and transcribe every word to match what it would sound like, right? Choose like one word, or maybe two max throughout that's going to give that flavor, instead of trying to transcribe how it sounds, because that gets really cumbersome in reading. But you do want to give that feel. The thing about writing is it's so much about, it's not realistic in all reality. If you were to take how people talk and write it on page, that's not how we write. We write how people think we talk. We write in a way that they get the feeling that it's real, but it's not really the way we talk. It's really to make it easy to read and to give flavor of something. And I think if you keep that in mind, it helps. All right, so moving to plot and characters. Some points to consider. Again, you have to know who your audience is, right? It's going to determine your age. It's going to determine what type of character you're creating and what type of problems that they have. So, these are your gatekeepers, right? Okay, I'm just kidding about the library. I just can't resist. But you have to, if you're writing a middle grade, you need to know your book's going to go to these people first. Before it ever reaches your intended audience, they're going to read it and decide if it's appropriate for their kids to read. And that is why you don't really include swearing. That is why when you take a topic, you want to make it appropriate for kids and make it fun and make it something that they can relate to. And I say fun, but sad books are okay too, right? Sad books, kids like sad books. I think a lot of times we say it, we limit ourselves. We say, no, kids don't want to read about the hard things they go through. And that's not true. And I think it's important to know that kids go through hard things just like adults do. And they need a place to learn how to deal with it. And that's what books do. All right. Oops. There's my mistake. We need to have our characters be relatable to an audience. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to have gone through everything that a character has gone through. Like, take Harry Potter. Did any of you get your letter when you were 11 and discover that you were a wizard? What? You didn't? Me neither! Oh! So sad. But it doesn't matter that we did not have that discovery. We can relate to Harry Potter because he wanted love, and he didn't have it from the people he felt with. He felt alone, and he wanted to find people who would accept him for who he was. And that is what we mean by finding the heart. We want to find something that our audience can relate to. So Cinderella, it's why Cinderella works so well. Who has never felt like they just have so much to do they're never going to get it done? Or felt like everyone around them just makes them work. All I do is work, and I'm alone, and I'm not appreciated. We've all been there and felt it, and it's why Cinderella has been retold so many times throughout the world in various forms. We need to make sure that our characters have a purpose or a goal. If they don't, this is kind of what it feels like. Chasing around, not sure which direction you're going. Where's this book headed anyway? I don't even know why I'm reading this. We need to give them a reason for writing a book, right? What are they trying to achieve throughout the story? And if they don't have that, it really takes, basically you don't have a book if you don't have that. Will the conflict make your main character suffer? As authors, sometimes it's hard to make our characters suffer. We love our characters. We care about our characters. We don't want to see them struggle, but they have to struggle. Who here has seen Star Wars? I hope all of you, right? So Luke, I'm going to confess, I think he is the whiniest, most annoying character in the world. Like, at the start of Star Wars, holy cow, Uncle Owen, I want to go play with my friends. It wasn't until he suffered that I said, okay, now I can relate to this guy. Now I want to see what happens. What does he do from here? Making our characters suffer makes them relatable. And it also gives them a purpose. So, make your characters suffer. I know, it's so cool, right? Will your main character be able to proactively work towards resolution? And this is really important, especially if you're writing for youth, for young readers. Kids don't want to see adults fixing all their problems, and they shouldn't. They should be empowered. They should learn that they can fix their own problems. They can work with help, usually, right? With help, but that they have power, that they can fix their problems. And that is what we need to create, right? They need to be able to work towards that. And if we've created a story where they really can't do that, then we have a problem. It's also why we have the orphan syndrome going on in middle grade books, right? Parents do prevent kids from doing dangerous and scary things. And so a lot of times, just take those parents out, and now they're free to do whatever they want. They can go on that dangerous mission to save the world. They can go sneak into that hideaway of Russian spies or whatever it is, because there are no parents, right? So that's why, if you've ever wondered why there are so many kids without parents in middle grade, this is why. And finally, you need to consider your character arc. Will your character change by the end? And if they won't, you might want to think about that, right? Usually we start in one spot and we get to another spot. There are exceptions, what we call a flat character arc, Wonder Woman being the prime example. But most characters need to grow. They need to change. They need to find something that they fix and have a different worldview at the end. So take Wonder. I love this example because it's not just the main character who has to change by the end, who grows and changes. It's all the characters in the book. You see their growth, you see their progress. He starts at the beginning with, he doesn't even want to show his face to anyone, wears a helmet all the time, and gets to the end where he's proud of who he is, stands up in front of a whole audience, a whole huge crowd, and accepts an award just for being who he is, right? That's what we need. We need to have our characters change and grow so that they have learned something, and we feel that as a reader, like, yes, I can do the same thing. I can change and grow, because books are how we learn. Okay, so story structure. Do you guys want to go through the classic story structure, or shall I leave more time for questions? Okay, we'll go for it. All right. There's all kinds of story structures. I'm going to just go through the classic structure, and I think that picture books really simplify things for us. They really highlight, it takes out the large factor that he was talking about, right? And so you can really see the structure very clearly. So who here has read Click, Clack, Move, Cows That Pipe? Okay, most of you, so that's good. So, because I'm not reading it. The first thing in books, we have the exposition, right? So exposition is setting the stage for the story. This is where you show where your story is set, you show who your main character is, and you show what they want. That's their goal, right? We talked about that before. So, who is your main character? What do they want? In Click, Clack, Moo, who's our main character?
Cows.
The cows. What do they want? Anyone remember?
Electric blankets.
Electric blankets. That's their goal in their life. They want these electric blankets, right? There's your exposition. Really simplified in picture books, which conflict. So now you've got conflict. Your conflict is what is keeping your character from getting what they want, aka the problem, right? So what is keeping the cows from getting what they want?
Farmer Brown.
Farmer Brown. Boy, that farmer. Why doesn't he just give them the blankets to begin with? His poor cows are cold, right? But he's stingy and doesn't want to give them these blankets. They're okay in the barn. They've always been in the barn. They don't need blankets. So from your conflict, you have your inciting incident. This is what triggers all the rest of the action. Once this happens, the events are inevitable. Everything moves forward. So who knows what the inciting incident is in Click Clack Moo Cows the Type? The typewriter. Suddenly the cows have a voice, right? They have a way to express their wants and tell Farmer Brown, this is what we want. And so then we have the rising action, which is increasing obstacles, right? So either it's increasing different obstacles or it's bigger and bigger plans to get past one obstacle. In Click Clack Moo Cows the Type, we've got the second situation, right? Now, in books, the magic number is 3. Usually it's 3 obstacles. Either they face 3 and then solve it, or they face 2 and solve it on the 3rd time. Usually. It's not always 100% the case. But I think you'll find in a lot of books, it still works. 3 is a magic number. If you want your character to struggle and move forward, consider having 3 different things that they have to get past. It's what you see in movies all the time. 3 wishes, 3 pigs, 3 bears. You see it everywhere because 3 is a magic number. Somehow it just makes us happy. So, the first plan that the cows have is they ask nicely. Dear Farmer Brown, the barn is very cold at night. We'd like some electric blankets. Sincerely, the cows. That's a good plan, right? Let's ask nicely. But Farmer Brown says no. So, their next plan, they go on strike. No milk, no eggs. We're going to get those electric blankets, right? So, bigger plans. This is something bigger. It's not just a simple nice. Until finally, they have the lockdown. And they lock all the animals out of the barn to make the big, final decision of what they're going to do to get those blankets, right? Bigger and bigger and bigger within our obstacles. Until we get to the climax. And the climax is the height of tension. It's the most exciting moment of your story. Will they or won't they? What's going to happen? And in Farmer Brown, it's the moment Duck brings the final letter from the cows to Farmer Brown. Will he or won't he? We're all with bated breath to see what Farmer Brown is going to do about this note and what it says, right? And this is where we've got the falling action. Now that we've had the highest moments, our falling action is going to lead towards our resolution, right? This is what happens. What does Farmer Brown do?
He gives in.
He gives in. He says, all right, we will trade. The cows say, we will trade our typewriter for electric blankets. Farmer Brown thinks that's a good plan, so he accepts it. So there's our events. Farmer Brown accepts it. The problem is now solved, right? In the resolution. So, problem is solved. The cows got their blankets. All is happy. Or is it? Right? And you can have your little twist at the end. Poor Farmer Brown did not get the deal that he thought he was going to get because Duck was so tricky. So that's your basic plot. But those are very important things that you need to include when you write your stories. And that is true for any book, right? You need to have the character, and you need to have a goal for your character. You need to have the conflict that's going to cause them to move forward and do something until you come to your climax. You need to have all of this to have a book. It's not necessarily going to be as neat as it was in the picture book where you've got a lot fewer words, but generally speaking, that's what you need. And then here finally we want to get to what makes a book engaging. So what do you think? What makes a book engaging?
I think it's relatable enough that you feel like you can connect with it, but there's something different enough that you don't feel like you're just reading about your life.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really great answer. Anybody else? Okay. So, I wanted to talk about some that are really engaging. We'll start there. Harry Potter. That took over the world. It was so engaging. What made it so engaging?
The problem.
The problem, right? Good versus evil. We've got Voldemort, right? That's definitely interesting and engaging. Any other ideas?
I think it was like taking an ordinary life and making it magical.
I think absolutely. You've got this whole magical world that exists within our own world, right? I think that is very engaging. Making the ordinary extraordinary. Anything else? I think also we talked about it earlier. We can relate to Harry Potter, right? Who hasn't wanted to feel loved? Who hasn't lost someone they loved and felt alone, right? We can relate to that because we've been there. Hunger Games, that kind of took over for a while there too, right? People would say how they couldn't put the book down. Why was Hunger Games so engaging? No ideas? See a hand here.
That someone would give up something for someone else and would be this normal person because people like thinking that they can do things that are great.
No, I think that's a really great answer. They put themselves in Katniss's position, right? If someone you loved was going to face most certain death, would you step up and do it? And we want to feel like we would, wouldn't we?
I think it's like the characters for me. Like I felt like I really enjoyed the characters in the book.
Definitely. You really enjoyed the characters. The characters you felt connected to, like you said earlier. So, Twilight. That also was a very engaging book. I wanted to share Twilight in particular because most people who, even the people who loved the book Twilight, I know it's like a very controversial, right? People who loved it and people who didn't love it. But there was a big following of people who did. Even those people, though, would say, oh, it's not a very well-written book, right? I wanted to point this out because making an engaging book is not necessarily about your writing. It's about something else. It's about that connection. It's about putting yourself in the place of the character and wanting to do what that character does. So I asked the same question on Facebook. I wanted to get some ideas of what other people thought about this. I said, tell me a book that you really connected to and why. And I got a lot of different answers. Here's one. Where the Wild Things Are. Max is my spirit animal. He isn't a bad kid. He's just misunderstood. So he kind of put himself in the place of that character. And then I had to add the second part that he added because, right? Actually, I could give you some more serious books, but children's books tend to speak complex messages more clearly. I couldn't not say that, right? Because children's books, they do. Someone else said, Number the Stars. As a little girl, I wanted to be brave like her and be willing to help save people regardless of the consequences. She's putting herself in the place of the characters. I loved To Kill a Mockingbird because it made me feel such strong emotions, right? So engaging books make you feel something. It's not just about reading words on a page, it's about evoking emotion. The first half of When Breath Becomes Air was like I was looking inside my own husband's inner being. The author put feelings, situations, circumstances into words that my husband can't even begin to speak about. It opened up a conversation with my husband that had both of us in tears. So again, we've got that emotion. We've got that, I recognize this character in someone I love, right? So they're putting people they love in their own place. I was pregnant when I read Sarah's Key, and I have always been interested in World War II events. But I think the fact that it takes place in France, she was a French citizen, with children just really made me think even harder about what all really happened during that time. Knowing that I could have relatives involved, I don't know, I just really felt connected to it. Sometimes it's hard to word it, but that connected to it, right? She really felt connected. She felt like she was in that same place. Like, what would I have done in that situation? Because I have a young child, just like she does. I'm about to have a young child. Really just put herself in that situation. Dandelion Wine. I can relate to the author, Ray Bradbury. His fondness to youth and love of summer, new shoes feeling like gazelles and antelopes, last summer as a child, happiness machine that really made you sad, iPhone. I could relate to the descriptions and feelings, their thoughts and feelings I had. She felt everything that those characters felt. She put herself in that position. Boys in the Boat. As a rower, the author captured the feeling of a boat and crew that I've never been able to put in words. In addition, based on University of Washington's rowing team, where I did my master's, so there's a connection there beyond just the characters. But this one was amazing. Actually, I found myself crying a couple of times because of the imagery in the book. And I can tell you this person doesn't cry very often. But that emotion, right? Books that people connect to really capture that emotion for them. So what's the common thread in all of this? It made them feel something, right? It brings out those emotions. And two, they connected to it on a personal level. They related to the characters, to the story, to the situation, whatever it happened to be. They felt connected to it. And those two things are key in writing an engaging book for anybody, not just for you, right? So if you're writing for adults, use this. All right, so what makes a book engaging? Readers connecting on an emotional level, putting it straight. I just wanted to share a couple more things. So the third rail is Lisa Crone, who wrote the book of Story Genius, which is a writing book. She talks about this third rail, and she says the third rail is your main character's internal struggle, right? The plot gets meaning and emotional weight based on how the internal struggle affects your main character. That is what sparks our interest and drives the story forward. So it's nice to know that emotions and having something that our readers can connect to, but how do we do that? This is how we do that. So you need to make your character's inner struggle something that your readers can relate to. We talked about that with Harry Potter. We talked about that with Katniss, things that they could relate to, right? So to connect on an emotional level, I'm going to give you two things you need to do. One, you need an inner conflict that readers can relate to. And two, you need a plot that forces your character to face that inner conflict. Right? Not just any old plot and any old inner conflict. Those two need to be connected intricately. If you want to really make your book in a way that's going to engage your readers, bring out those emotions, and make them feel connected to your characters. And if you can do that, then you're going to have those people with your book that don't want to let it go because they feel so connected to it. All right. And good. I managed to get through it all and still leave time for a couple of questions. What questions do you have?
I kind of would be interested in your story. Like, have you always written books? Have you always had thoughts? How'd you find an editor? Like, can you walk me through your process?
Absolutely. I'll give you the shortened version of it so sleep other times. But I always enjoyed writing, and I never wanted to be an author, ever. I remember specifically in 6th grade reading a book about a kid that wrote to an author. I thought, oh, that's so cool that the author, that would be so cool. But wow, I would never want to do that. But I loved writing, and I was always writing. And in college, I would, in my spare time, which you don't have in college, right? I would write just silly stories that I would read to my roommate, and we would just stay up late laughing at these stories. And so when I finally got married, my husband was like, you need to just do it. Just write it. And so I started writing the book, and I wrote the first draft of this book in Ecuador. We were there, and I got really sick, and I could do nothing. They had no books to read, no movies I could watch. I could lay in bed, and I had a pad of paper. So I wrote the first draft of this book, and perfect. It was the best book ever. And it was not, just so you know. And so my husband convinced me that I could do this. I could be an author. And I'm like, I just need to prove it once. I can just prove that I can get published, and then I can get it out of my system, and I won't have to keep doing it. So I sent off a query letter to one agent, and she requested pages, which was amazing. If any of you have queries, you'll know that's amazing. And then she got my pages and wrote back and said, well, I could tell you're talented, but maybe keep working. And I set this aside and didn't write for a long time. And but I missed it. And when it came down to it, I just wanted to write for fun. And I love fairy tales, so I started writing stories. And I wrote a book that is not published and probably never will be. It's very problematic. But I love that book. And it taught me how to write by doing it. It's when I started getting involved in, I got a critique group doing that, so I started exchanging with other writers. And that's where I started to learn, oh, that's how you do that. That's why you do that. Oh, I see. I need to change these. It really taught me a lot. And so when I got to the point where I was ready to write the next book, I stumbled across my old manuscript, and I read through it, and I was horrified that I'd sent it to an agent. It was so bad. It was bad. And but I loved the characters. Again, with that whole connection, I connected with the characters. I just thought, oh, these characters are alive, and I need to do something with them. So I took a few things from that first draft, and just like you said, I set it aside, took a few things, and rewrote it completely without looking at it. because it needed to be. It didn't have a plot before, so there was that. So I gave it a plot. Yeah. And I wrote it and revised and revised and revised. And I tried to get an agent and was not able to do that. And so then I had a critique by an editor. I won it in an auction, I think. It was the first 10 pages. And she said, you know, you have a really great character. I noticed you put this in third person. Your character is so spunky. Would you ever consider revising to first person? What? That's so much. That's like the whole book. And it was. I wrote it completely, again, from third person. Not 100%, not quite the same. But I switched it to first person, and she was right. Changed everything about the book. And I sent it, and I had a lot of requests, and it didn't quite happen. And I was going to set it aside and move on to the next one. I had the next manuscript ready. And I had a friend who tried last second. She's like, I'm going to do 10 more, and then I'm done. I said, okay, I can do that. So I entered a pitch contest where I could just get 10 done, boom, all at once. And I got in, and I got so many offers of people who wanted to read it, and from that I was shocked. Even ones who had already rejected me on my book. And so the agent who won ended up asking for a phone call, and so I signed with her. It took about a year and a half from the time I signed with her, between revisions with her and going before it sold, to capstone. And so in terms of finding an editor, I did not find the editor. More of you go on submission with your agent. I decided to go the agent route because I wanted to write. I didn't want to do everything else. And contracts kind of scare me, I'm going to be honest. Like, you've heard stories. So I'm a huge proponent of agents because they do so much for you. They read through the contracts to make sure. I know they made big changes to my contract for this book. They got me higher percentages, higher advances, things like that. So I'm a huge proponent of an agent. Since this book, we're out of time. But that's the basic story of how I got to that, and then since, move forward. Any other questions about the topic before, we've got like lunchtime right now. But I will be talking more about agents and editors though in my next presentation, and I'm going to talk a lot more about where I've been with that. So if you want to hear more, feel free to join me then. But thank you so much, and